Chapter 1: The News. My name is Ethan Stone. I'm 35, and I head the Mountain Rescue Service in Colorado. My wife Rachel is a doctor at the local clinic. She's 32. We've been married for 7 years, and I thought I knew everything about her, until I found out about her affair with Adrian Brown, a renowned surgeon from Denver. I was planning revenge, but fate intervened, bringing us and Brown together during a rescue operation in the mountains. What happened there changed all of us forever. Rachel told me she was pregnant on Friday evening. I had just returned from a shift. We had spent the whole day searching for lost tourists in the northern sector. She met me at the door with that special smile that I remembered from when we first met. She had a small white envelope in her hands. "I have something to show you," she said, handing me the test results. I remember my hands shaking as I read through the medical terms until I came across the main thing: pregnancy, positive. We had been waiting for this for so long. 7 years of attempts, disappointments, and hopes, and now it had finally happened. Looking at the smiling Rachel with the test in her hands, I suddenly clearly remembered the day we first met. 7 years ago, a military hospital in Denver. I had just returned from my last tour of duty, 3 bullets in my left shoulder and a fragment in my hip. I remember trying to get to the procedure room on my own, stubbornly refusing a wheelchair. At the turn of the corridor, I stumbled, my foot twisted, and I almost fell. "Well, well, are the Marines flying now?" I heard a mocking female voice. A young nurse in a snow-white coat caught me by the elbow. Her touch was firm and at the same time surprisingly gentle. "The Marine Corps doesn't give up," I mumbled, trying to maintain my dignity. Of course," she rolled her eyes. "That's why you're about to fall and break all my IVs. Let's sit down instead." She sat me down in a chair, and I was finally able to get a good look at her. Light brown eyes, a stray lock of hair falling out from under her medical cap, and that special smile, slightly mocking, but kind. A smile that I fell in love with before I even knew her name. "Rachel Connors," she introduced herself, checking my bandages. "And you, I presume, are that stubborn patient from Ward 23 who refuses to take painkillers." "Ethan Stone," I tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "And I'm not stubborn, I just don't like feeling helpless." She paused for a moment, her fingers frozen on the bandage. "You know what, Sergeant Stone? Sometimes the greatest courage is letting others help you." I didn't pay attention to her words then. I didn't realize how prophetic they would be years later. At that moment, I was just watching the sunlight play in her hair, and I thought I had never seen anyone more beautiful. "And now march back to your ward," she ordered. "And no freelancing or I'll tie you to the bed." "Is that a threat or a promise?" I blurted out. She laughed, easily and brightly, and it seemed to me that the empty hospital corridor became a little brighter. But let's get back to today. The next few days passed in a haze of joy. We made plans, chose names, argued about the color of the nursery. Rachel glowed with happiness, and I thought that our life had finally found the fullness that we had always lacked. If only I knew what would happen next. On Wednesday, I stopped by for lunch at Joe's, a small cafe opposite the clinic where Rachel worked. We often met there during her break, but that day I decided to surprise her. Through the large window, I saw her at a table in the back of the room. She wasn't alone. Opposite her sat a tall man in an expensive suit, Dr. Adrian Brown, a well-known surgeon from Denver who periodically flew in to operate at our clinic. Nothing unusual, just a business lunch between colleagues. But something in their postures, in the way they leaned towards each other, in the accidental touches of their hands, made my heart clench. I stood there for about 10 minutes, watching my wife laugh at his jokes, how she tossed her hair back with that special gesture that I thought was only for me. And then I turned around and left. That evening, while Rachel was in the shower, I did something I had never done before. I took her phone. I knew the password, our wedding date. My hands were shaking as I opened the correspondence with Brown. The first message was dated 6 months earlier. "I can't stop thinking about you after yesterday." And then hundreds of messages, photos, declarations of love. The last one was sent that morning. I can't wait for our next meeting, my love. The next day I couldn't concentrate on work. Fragments of their correspondence swirled in my head, and the scene in the cafe was before my eyes. I had to find out more. In our small town, everyone knows everything about each other, and it turned out to be easy to gather information about Dr. Brown. Betsy, our dispatcher, whose husband worked as a security guard at the clinic, willingly shared information. "Oh, Dr. Brown comes to us every 2 weeks," she chirped, unaware of how each of her words pierced my heart. "He's a leading neurosurgeon in Denver, and we don't have any specialists like that here. They say that the hospital pays him a fortune for these visits. He always flies in on his private plane. A real medical star." I listened and pieced the picture together in my head. Every 2 weeks. So all those business trips of Rachel's to Denver for conferences, all those night shifts and emergency surgeries. How could I have been so blind? 7 years of marriage turned to ashes in a matter of minutes. I remembered how Rachel had changed in recent months: new clothes, hairstyle, perfume. "I want to look good for you," she said. Now I understood who all these changes were really for. In the evening, I sat in our home office going through our photos together. Here's our wedding, Rachel in a white dress, so happy. Here we are hiking in the mountains, she's holding my hand tightly, afraid of stumbling on the steep trail. Here's last Christmas, she's blowing out the candles on the holiday pie and I'm hugging her from behind. Happy moments that now seemed fake. And then a new thought hit me in the stomach: pregnancy. When exactly did it happen? Can I be sure that the child is mine? I didn't sleep all night, tossing and turning on the sofa in the living room. I told Rachel that I didn't want to bother her because of an urgent work report. She pretended to believe me. Maybe she was even glad more time to correspond with her lover. Thoughts swirled like a snowstorm in the mountains. I tried to remember every detail of the past months, every oddity in my wife's behavior, every inconsistency in her stories. It's strange how we don't notice obvious things until we learn the truth. I turned on the laptop and opened the clinic calendar where Dr. Brown's visits were marked. The dates coincided perfectly with Rachel's business trips. We had been trying to have a child unsuccessfully for 7 years, and suddenly, as if by magic, she gets pregnant right now. It couldn't be a coincidence. At some point, I caught myself studying forums for abandoned husbands. The stories were different, but the pain in them sounded the same. By dawn, I realized that I couldn't just leave it like that. It wasn't even about the betrayal. I could have tried to forgive, start over, but lying about the child, that was too much. I took out my work tablet and opened maps of mountain routes. Brown, as I knew from conversations at the clinic, loved to go to the mountains during his visits. "A great way to clear your head after a complicated surgery," he said. "Well, anything can happen in the mountains, even with experienced hikers." The plan came together on its own. On his next arrival, Brown will definitely go for his usual walk. I know these trails like the back of my hand: every stone, every turn, every dangerous section. No one will be surprised if a successful surgeon from a big city stumbles on a steep slope. This happens all the time with self-confident tourists. Rescuers will find the body. There will be an investigation, but no traces. A perfect accident. In the morning, I kissed Rachel as usual, said that I loved her. She smiled and stroked her stomach, a gesture that used to fill me with happiness, but now only caused dull pain. I left the house and got into the car. Ahead was a normal working day in the rescue service, but now I had a goal. I took out my phone and opened the schedule of private planes arriving at our small airport. Brown was due to arrive in 3 days. There was just enough time to prepare everything. Chapter 2: The Crash. I spent the next 3 days preparing my plan. As I prepared my revenge plan, I involuntarily remembered Cobble and Mike Donovan. He and I served in the same unit, shared the last bottle of water, covered each other under fire. That day, we were checking intelligence data about a weapons depot. The information came from a local informant whom Mike trusted like a brother. "This man has never let us down," he convinced the commander. "I'm ready to vouch for him." I still remember every second of that morning. A dusty street, scorching air, shimmering over the roofs of houses. Mike and I were walking first, he on the right, I on the left. He was telling me something about his daughter who was turning 5 in a month. 2 days before, he had shown me a photo, a fair-haired girl in a pink dress, an exact copy of her mother. The explosion thundered when we were 10 meters from the target. An improvised explosive device, disguised as a pile of rubbish. The informant whom Mike trusted so much turned out to be a double agent. He deliberately lured us into a trap. I found Mike first. He was still breathing, trying to say something, but there was too much blood. I held his hand as he passed away. His last words were his daughter's name. Since then, I have hated betrayal more than death. When you go into battle, you are prepared for the fact that you may die from an enemy bullet, but to be killed by those you trust, that's something else entirely. Maybe that's why Rachel's betrayal hit so hard. It reminded me of that day in Kabul, that moment when I realized the person we trusted had sent us to our deaths in cold blood. I looked at my hands, holding the photos from my wife's phone, and saw Mike's blood on them. I heard his last whisper, and I felt the same helpless rage. Betrayal is not forgiven, I said to myself, planning my revenge on Brown, just as I didn't forgive that informant. We tracked him down in 2 weeks. Justice was served, but that didn't bring Mike back. His daughter grew up without a father. I shook my head, driving away the memories. No, this time everything will be different. No traces, no evidence. Just an accident in the mountains. They happen so often with self-confident city tourists. Working in the mountain rescue service taught me one thing: any accident must look natural. Too many times we have found the bodies of unlucky tourists who decided that the mountains are just big hills for hiking. I knew that Brown was walking along the northern route, the most scenic and the most dangerous, especially at this time of year when stones crumble after rains and crevices are hidden under a layer of fallen leaves. I methodically studied his habits. They gossiped at the clinic that he always goes for a walk after a difficult operation, to clear his head, as he said. He usually went alone, without accompaniment, another typical mistake of city smart guys who think that their experience of hiking in well-groomed parks in Denver means something in real mountains. This time he had a difficult spinal surgery planned, so after it he would definitely go for his traditional walk. I had already picked out the perfect place, a narrow ledge above an abyss, where the trail makes a sharp turn. A small push or just a fright is enough, and a person loses balance. This has happened more than once. That day our duty shift started as usual. I was checking the equipment when the radio crackled in the dispatch center. Betsy, our dispatcher, flew into the room with a face as white as chalk. "Ethan, emergency call: a tourist plane has disappeared from the radar. A C-47 with a children's sports team on board. Last coordinates the northern sector, somewhere between Eagle and Bear Peaks." I turned cold. This was one of the most difficult areas. If the plane really crashed there, every minute counted. We immediately raised 2 search teams. According to protocol, a doctor was required in such cases. Injuries in plane crashes are always serious. I reached for the phone to call the medics from the clinic, but Betsy beat me to it. "I've already contacted the hospital. They said that the only available surgeon right now is Dr. Brown. He just finished surgery and—" I didn't listen to the end. Brown. Of course it had to be him. The man I was planning to kill was now supposed to fly with me to save children. Fate sometimes plays cruel tricks on us. 20 minutes later, his Bentley was already pulling up to our base. He looked impeccable even after a multi-hour surgery, expensive suit, perfect hairstyle, the confident gait of a man used to everyone's attention. Noticing me, he nodded politely. He didn't know that I knew about his affair with my wife. I silently handed him the rescue equipment. "Haven't flown on rescue missions in a long time, doctor?" I asked, helping him fasten his seat belts in the helicopter. He shook his head. "Honestly, never. Everything is somehow simpler in Denver." I chuckled to myself. Now this polished gentleman will find out what real work in the mountains is. The helicopter took off, carrying us towards the unknown. Brown sat opposite me, his face gradually turning pale from the pitching. I wondered what he was thinking about. about how he kissed my wife, about the child I thought was mine. I gripped the seat handle tighter, fighting the urge to tell him everything right now. The pilot reported on the radio that we were approaching the supposed crash site. Below, among the rocks, were the wreckage of the plane, scattered across the mountainside like children's toys. We saw the first signs of life. Several figures were waving their hands at us near a large piece of the fuselage. But it was too early to rejoice. We landed on a small area about 100 meters from the main crash site. The first thing that hit the nose was the smell of aviation fuel mixed with something metallic. The team's coach, limping, ran up to us as soon as we unloaded the equipment. His face was covered in blood, but he didn't even notice it. "There are children there, 8 people, 3 in critical condition," he gasped, either from running fast along the mountainside or from the shock he had experienced. "Jimmy, he has an open leg fracture and something's wrong with his stomach. Sarah is unconscious, possibly a concussion. Mike, he's trapped in the tail section." Brown instantly transformed. Where did his pampered mannerisms go? Before me stood a collected professional, ready to work. He quickly gave orders, sorting the injured according to the severity of their injuries. I watched him out of the corner of my eye while deploying rescue equipment. Well, at least he knew his job well. "We need to organize a field hospital here," he turned to me. "Is there a flat place for a canopy? We'll prepare the most severely injured for transportation." I nodded and pointed to a relatively flat area a little higher up the slope. We started lifting the equipment there when I noticed the first signs of an approaching storm, the characteristic darkening of the sky in the west and a sharp drop in temperature. The mountains seemed to decide to test us. The wind was increasing every minute, bringing with it prickly snow grains. Visibility was falling rapidly. I knew that it would soon be real hell here. Such storms are especially dangerous at this time of year. The helicopter will not be able to fly after us until the wind subsides. And that means we are stuck here for a long time, and all responsibility for the lives of these children lies with Brown and me. "How much time do we have until the peak of the storm?" he asked, finishing bandaging another victim. His hands were covered in blood, but his movements remained precise and confident. An hour and a half at most," I replied, looking at the rapidly darkening sky. "Then you won't be able to see your own hand here." He nodded, not taking his eyes off the wound. "So, we need to stabilize the severely injured before the fun begins." There was no fear in his voice, only the focus of a person used to working under pressure, and I caught myself feeling an involuntary respect for him. Well, that only made the task more difficult. Chapter 3: The Choice. The storm was gaining strength, turning our makeshift hospital into a small island in the middle of white chaos. We had been working shoulder to shoulder with Brown for several hours, and I couldn't help but admit he was a damn good doctor. His hands didn't tremble even when gusts of wind shook our tarpaulin canopy, and his eyes remained focused despite fatigue. He managed to operate on Jimmy right here, in the field, the most difficult operation on internal organs in the light of camping lanterns. The boy was now asleep, his condition stabilized. "We need to check the others," Brown said, pulling off his bloody gloves. His expensive suit was hopelessly ruined, his face was frozen in a mask of fatigue, but his movements still felt confident. "Especially that guy in the tail section. How much painkiller do we have left?" I checked the first aid kit, 2 syringes of morphine. That should be enough. We moved through the snow whirlwind to the tail section of the plane. There, trapped between twisted metal structures, lay Mike, a 14-year-old goalkeeper of the team. His right leg was pinned down, and his face turned gray from pain and cold. Brown immediately realized we couldn't get him out without special equipment. We had to wait for help, but the boy was already starting to develop hypothermia. Suddenly, the wind carried a faint cry from somewhere up the slope. We exchanged glances. "There must be someone else there," I shouted through the howling storm. The coach said there were 8 children. We only found 7. Brown immediately moved in the direction of the cry. I wanted to stop him. Going along such a slope in a storm was pure suicide, but he was already scrambling up. His determination surprised me. This man, accustomed to sterile operating rooms and the comfort of big cities, was now risking his life for someone else's child. I followed him, cursing myself for the involuntary admiration of the man I was planning to kill. We climbed up the treacherously slippery slope, clinging to stones and helping each other. Visibility was no more than a meter. Snow was covering our eyes. The wind was knocking us off our feet. And then I heard it, a faint child's cry, already closer. Brown heard it too and quickened his pace. That's what let him down. The edge of the rock, covered with snow, deceived him. I saw how the ground literally went out from under his feet. At the last moment he managed to grab onto a ledge. Now he was hanging over the abyss, his fingers, white from tension, slowly slipping off the stone. "Help me," his voice trembled, but there was no fear in his eyes, only some doomed resolve. "Hurry, we need to get to the child." And at that moment, as if fate was mocking us, a child's cry was heard again through the howling wind, now weaker. I knew what it meant. The child had only minutes left in the cold. I had only one rescue rope, and there was only enough time for one operation: either pull Brown out or get to the child in time. Here it is, the moment I was waiting for. Fair retribution was coming into my hands. No one would doubt that I had done everything possible, but simply did not have time to save them both. A silent death in a snowstorm, not so bad for a man who destroyed my family. But something was holding me back from simply turning around and leaving. "Listen to me carefully." Brown's voice suddenly became surprisingly calm, despite his position. "I know that you know everything about me and Rachel." His fingers continued to slip off the snowy ledge. "And about the pregnancy. But you need to know the truth. That child is definitely not mine." I froze, not believing my ears. Snow continued to hit my face, but I barely noticed it. "What are you talking about?" "I'm infertile." His voice broke from tension. "The consequences of chemotherapy 10 years ago. It was I who told Rachel that the child can only be yours. That's why she decided to end everything. Break up with me." A new gust of wind almost knocked me off my feet. Somewhere above, a weakening child's cry rang out again. Time was running out like sand through my fingers. "Save the child," Brown suddenly said. "I don't deserve it anyway. I ruined your family. Forgive me." I reached out to him with the rope, but he shook his head. "There's no time. You have a chance to save only one of us, and it should be the child." His fingers turned white from tension, but there was resolve in his eyes. I saw in them a reflection of the same pain that had been gnawing at me all these days. My hatred for him suddenly seemed so petty in the face of his willingness to sacrifice himself. "Come on," he whispered. "Time is running out." And before I could do anything, his fingers unclenched. At the last moment, I lunged forward, trying to grab him, but I only caught emptiness. His body disappeared in the snow whirlwind, taking with it all my plans for revenge. The child's cry above became very weak. I broke from the spot, scrambling up the slope. Now every second counted, and I had no right to let down another life. Brown's death gave me a chance to remain human, and I had to use it. Chapter 4: Redemption. I found the last child in a small crevice where he had apparently been thrown when he crashed. It was a girl of about 12, already almost unconscious from hypothermia. I wrapped her in my jacket and pressed her to myself, trying to warm her. Her pulse was weak but stable. We were in time. As I descended with her back to the camp, Brown's face still stood before my eyes at that last moment. His last choice changed everything. Not only the fate of this girl, but also my understanding of what is really important in life. By morning, the storm subsided. Rescue helicopters were finally able to reach us and began evacuating the children. I mechanically did my work, helping to load the stretchers, checking the fasteners, giving commands. But my thoughts were far away. A search party had already gone to look for Brown's body, although in such terrain it could take days or even weeks. I reported the incident as an accident during a rescue operation. After all, it was true. Partial truth. I returned home only in the evening. I opened the door with my key and froze on the threshold. Rachel was sitting in the living room, curled up in a ball in her favorite armchair. Her face was swollen from tears, so she already knows. News spreads quickly in a small town. She raised her eyes to me, full of pain and guilt. "I know everything," she said softly, "about what happened in the mountains, and I have something to tell you." Her voice trembled, her hands nervously clutching the edge of the plaid. "I loved you both, differently but loved. Adrian appeared in my life when I felt so lonely. You were always in the mountains, saving others, and I just wanted someone to save me." I silently looked at her. Now, after everything that had happened, my rage seemed distant and meaningless. "Why didn't you talk to me?" "I tried," she wiped away tears. "But you were so far away, even when you were near. Something changed after you returned from the Marine Corps. You built a wall around yourself and I couldn't break through it. And Adrian, he knew how to listen. He knew how to be there." I slumped into the armchair opposite her. Did he love you? This question tormented me even now. "Yes," she simply replied. "But when I told him about the pregnancy, he confessed that he couldn't have children. And then I realized all this time I was just trying to fill the void in our life, a void that we created together. The child, is he really mine?" Brown's words echoed in my head, but I had to hear it from her. Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with new tears. "Yes, and you know what? When I found out about the pregnancy, I realized that I had never really stopped loving you. I was going to end everything with Adrian. But now—" She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders began to shake. "Listen," I moved closer. "I have to tell you what happened there in the mountains." I started talking, and the words flowed in a stream, about how I found out about their affair, about my revenge plans, about Brown's last minutes on that cliff, about his confession and sacrifice. With each word, I saw how her face changed from pain to understanding, from grief to some new feeling. "He let go of his hand himself," my voice hoarsened, "so that I could save the child. His last words were, 'Forgive me,' and you know what? I forgave him. There on that slope, watching him disappear into the snowy haze, because he turned out to be better than I thought, better than myself at that moment." Rachel raised her tearful eyes to me. "What will happen to us now?" I looked at her stomach, where our child was growing hours without any doubt. "Now we will start over, if you're ready." "And you, can you forgive me?" I took her hand. For the first time in recent days, I touched her not as a stranger. "You know what I realized there in the mountains? That revenge and hatred make us blind. They make us forget about what is really important. Brown showed me this with his last act. He chose life, not his own, someone else's. And I also want to choose life, our life, the life of our child." She pressed against me, and I felt her tears wetting my shirt. We sat like this for a long time, embracing in silence. Outside the window, snow began to fall, the same as in the mountains, but here, in the warmth of our home, it seemed a symbol of purification, a new beginning. Somewhere deep down, I knew that the path to full restoration of trust would be long. But now we had something to walk this path for the sake of that new life that was growing under Rachel's heart, for the sake of our own second chance. "I will never betray you again," she whispered. "I know," I replied, stroking her hair. "I won't hide behind a wall anymore either, I promise."